Hello and welcome to this India Today World Economic Forum Davos Agenda Special. There are decades when nothing happens and then there are weeks when decades happen. Last year at this time we were on the snowy slopes of Davos, and now here we are on Zoom in this virtual Davos agenda in the middle of the worst pandemic the world has seen in a century. America and the world is in the midst of a major transition from the chaotic era of Donald Trump to the more conventional presidency of Joe Biden. What does this transition mean for the security paradigm in the Indo-Pacific region? Under Donald Trump, US-China relations plummeted. Is conflict now inevitable? And what does this rivalry mean for India, which is facing a serious Chinese aggression on its northern borders? For a broad sweep discussion on this topic, which lies at the center of many of the fissures of modern day geopolitics, we have lined up for this special discussion a first-rate panel of top international experts. It is my privilege to welcome one of the world's most renowned political theorists, the Master of Realism, Professor John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, a cult figure in the world of international relations. We have with us Ambassador Navtej Sarna, a well-regarded author and diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to the United States from 2016 to 18, when he guided India's engagement with the US during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. Dr. Parag Khanna joins us from Singapore. He's a top-notch global expert on geopolitics and author of multiple best-selling books like The Future is Asian. I have with me Professor Yun Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center. She's a leading global expert in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with its neighbors like India. Last but not least, Dhruv Jaishankar is the executive director of the US initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. He's one of our bright young scholars and joins us from Washington, D.C. I want to start this discussion by going across to Professor John Mearsheimer on how you see America's relationship with China being different from what we witnessed during the Trump administration. Is the conflict that we've seen build over the last 4 years going to get worse, or do you see some kind of an improvement in the US-China ties over the next 4 years of the Joe Biden presidency? Welcome, Professor Mearsheimer.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Let me make two general points. First of all, I don't think that there's going to be a fundamental change in the nature of the relationship. China is a rising great power. China is determined to dominate Asia and do whatever it can to push the Americans out of Asia. And that's going to happen whether Donald Trump is in the White House or Joe Biden is in the White House. It's a result of powerful structural forces. It's a result of the fact that we've transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. And inside of multipolarity, it's the US-China competition that matters more than anything else. So the basic nature of the relationship is not going to change. What is going to change, and this gets to my second point, is that Biden will do a much better job than Trump did dealing with America's allies in East Asia and in Asia more generally. The fact is that the Trump administration did a terrible job of dealing with allies and putting together a balancing coalition, an alliance structure that could be used to contain China. What the Biden administration will do is it will go to great lengths to work carefully with countries like Japan, South Korea, a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and India as well, to foster good relations among all those countries so that we can do a much better job of containing China than has been the case during the 4 years that President Trump was in the White House.
Professor Yun Sun, give those who are watching at this time your best sense of how Beijing perceives this transition in Washington, D.C. Do they see this as an opportunity to try and restore some elements of the relationship, or are the Mandarins in Beijing now reconciled to the idea that the relationship is only going to deteriorate and that is inevitable?
Well, thank you. That is a great question. I think the key words to describe where China is now and the Chinese policy community about Biden is that there is quite a lot of mixed feelings. So simply put, I think the Chinese policy community is much more assured with what they call the normalcy and decency of a Biden administration on a general level, but is still worried that the progress or improvement of relations on specific issues may not happen quickly or happen at all. So the Chinese expect much less heartburn associated with Trump's dramatic and disruptive policies. So for some Chinese, as long as Biden is a normal president and is a decent president and follows the normal rules of engagement, they feel that China can deal with him. And this happens in the context of the COVID-19, where China believes that it has come out as a winner in terms of the relative gains and losses associated with COVID. So in this sense, there is quite a prevalence of some optimism on the general level among the Chinese foreign policy wonks. A sense that no matter what happens, US-China relations under Biden is not going to be worse than under Trump. But this optimism, I would like to point out, is much less evident or prominent on the technical level, on specific technical issues. So the Chinese do recognize that the election of Biden only changes US president, but does not remove any of the friction points between US and China. So when they look at how US and China could repair their relationship and look at the issues such as Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, none of those issues has really disappeared. So on that, I would say that the Chinese optimism is much less evident on the specific and tactical issues. Thank you.
Dr. Parag Khanna, do you share this assessment that the last 1 year has given Xi Jinping and others in Beijing a greater sense of their moment having come, that this is China's big moment, let's seize it? Because even at this moment, the pandemic numbers continue to rage in the US while China has its corona numbers under control. That if there is to be a big Chinese coming out at the global level, this is our opportunity, and it doesn't matter whether you've got Trump or Joe Biden in the White House. Parag Khanna.
I think the evidence cuts in both directions. On the one hand, the fact that China has withstood the pandemic and been the only growing economy and has been able to continue to assert itself in ways that it did before the pandemic may point to some notion of a higher degree of ambition than even what they had before. On the other hand, there's evidence pointing in the opposite direction, which is that, of course, prior to the pandemic, was when the international community, when other regional powers and great powers really woke up to China's expansionism through the Belt and Road and debt trap diplomacy and other means, its technological expansion and so forth, and began to push back quite heavily against China. And we've seen this again going back several years. So I would say that Belt and Road and Huawei and other forces, of course, the launch of the trade war and investment restrictions on China, all of these countermeasures to the perception that China already was pushing too hard, going too big, baring its teeth, if you will, were quite evident before the pandemic, and the pushback had begun. The countermeasures had begun. Investment restrictions, new coalitions such as the Quad and so forth. Now, in the transition from Trump to Biden, let's remember that all of those countermeasures remain in place. You have, again, strong investment restrictions, you have the Quad, you have the D10, a whole range, the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, a whole range of efforts to minimize as much as possible dependency on China. And again, investment restrictions and so forth. So I think that this cuts in both directions. It could be that temporarily, and this is evidenced by the Chinese trade surplus, there is a greater dependence on China than before in light of their economic position at the moment. That said, the measures that are underway by a wide range of countries to prevent that dependency from deepening further in the future are also very, very strong. So I foresee, in terms of a medium and long-term picture, a sustained momentum by the rest of the world, led by the United States, led by Europe, Japan, India, and other countries, to ensure that China does not get to rule Asia, to impose its standards globally, and so forth.
Ambassador Navteej Sarna, how do you see this transition from the Trump era to the Biden era impacting India? You know, what Professor John Mearsheimer suggests is that things may not necessarily get worse, but they're unlikely to get much better. In that context, how do you see India in the midst of this growing China-US rivalry?
Thank you, Rahul. I think the first general point, which has been touched upon by previous speakers, is important in this context, that a lot of these problems are actually post-Trump. You know, China's behavior, China's attitude on the East and South China Sea, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the Indian borders, and its generally predatory economic and trade practices are going nowhere. That's the first point. The second point we have to remember from our point of view is that particularly during the Trump years, India has made very impressive strides in the cooperation between the two countries in this area, in the Indo-Pacific. The new Indo-Pacific, no longer the new, but the Indo-Pacific vision of the United States government, which was also put out a few days ago, again, shows a very important role for India in the vision of the Indo-Pacific. We have been closer in the defense and maritime security field. Our exercises have deepened. We've been moved out, if I may say so, from our traditional comfort zone as regards the Quad is concerned. So we would like actually to keep these gains ongoing in the Biden administration, and I frankly see no reason why they should not continue. The only thing that we should be watching out for, and I'm sure we are, is that in the change in administration, is it going to be merely a reset of tone and approach, or is there going to be a fundamental change in some relationship aspects with China? And I have in mind here possible deals that the US administration may seek on health, on climate change. And if so, China's already sort of made purring noises, seeking a better cooperation with the new administration. Now, it really depends how much this reset is, where this needle will stop. If the fundamentals don't change in the US-China relationship, and I think my bet is that they will not change, then India's position on the Indo-Pacific will only get strengthened. The US will need partners. The US can't do it alone in the Indo-Pacific. The US needs engagement not just with its traditional allies, but with strategic partners. And frankly, there is no more important strategic partner than India in the region. So I would watch with
so Dhruv Jaishankar, Professor Mearsheimer speaks of Biden being a more reliable partner when it comes to allies, and also of wanting to form balancing coalitions against Beijing, whereas Trump was mercurial and unpredictable from the perspective of even the closest allies. Do you see the next 4 years being a period where India more closely joins America's balancing coalition, which is what the US wants, and India initially at least wasn't so enthusiastic about, but the Chinese aggression now changes a lot of the equation and the thinking in Delhi? Or do you see us still trying to mend relations with China like we were before this aggression started?
I mean, I think on balance, the structural factors that Professor Mearsheimer speaks about will outweigh many of the other tactical considerations that are at play and the issue-specific considerations that are at play. That is, if you look at the broader balance of interests that India has vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the United States, clearly the alignment between India and the US is intensifying on almost every issue. There will continue to be some areas where India and the US will have disagreement, for example, on trade, on Russia, but these are largely have been managed in the recent past, and there's no reason at present to think that they can't be managed into the future. But overall, I think we will have to see where, as Ambassador Sarna rightly pointed out, where does the Biden administration come out on various issues. And so far, just based on the personnel that have been appointed to key positions and their actions during the transition and in the last 72 hours since the swearing in of Joe Biden as president, there is every indication to suggest that a lot of the naturally competitive policies that were put in place previously, including during the Trump administration, are likely to continue as the basis for engagement with the broader Indo-Pacific region. And with that in mind, obviously, there has been outreach already in the last few days to NATO allies in Europe, to Japan, to South Korea. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has spoken to his counterparts in those two countries. But I think as the new administration gets looks around the world and looks at where the key allies and partners are going to be, I think it will see in India a much more capable partner, and one that is on the same page on many of the key issues that are important for the U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific.
While no one knows for sure, but I want to spend the next few minutes asking all these experts about whether America over the next 4 years will be able to hold off and stall the Chinese advance, or is it only inevitable that China emerges by 2028 as the world's preeminent economic power and going forward military power as well, especially in the context of the Indo-Pacific region, which is of greatest importance to India. So I want to go across to Professor Miyashimaya first. Under Trump, it seemed as if America was hurtling into chaos. To what extent do you see Joe Biden being able to stem that tide? Will it be enough to be able to ward off, stall, or push back China's advance?
Well, what the Trump administration was trying to do was to slow down, if not do serious damage to the Chinese economy. During the Cold War, we used to talk about the distinction between containment and rollback. And it became clear once the Cold War was over with that the United States was interested in more than just containment. It was interested in rolling back the Soviet economy and ultimately wrecking the Soviet Union. What the Trump administration was doing was not simply trying to contain China, it was trying to wreck the Chinese economy, especially corporations like Huawei. No one knows for sure what the consequences of the Trump administration's economic policies towards China were or will be. And nobody knows exactly what the Biden administration will continue in the Trump menu of policies. So it's very hard to say exactly where the Chinese economy will be in 2028. And it's also difficult to say where the American economy will be. You know, you want to remember that before COVID happened, if you go back to January 2020, the American economy was zooming along and it looked like Trump was going to get reelected. The fundamentals in the case of the American economy are very strong. So I believe that over time, the American economy will continue to grow. The question is, will the United States be able to do anything to slow down Chinese economic growth? My guess is that the answer is no, that the Trump policies really have not had a major effect on Chinese economic growth. And in 2028, we're going to be facing a country, and this includes India as well as the United States, that is more powerful relative to us than it is today. This is the fundamental problem that we face. China has a lot of people. If it has a big per capita GNP, it is a Goliath. And it's a Goliath with a big appetite. Has a big appetite regarding the line of actual control. It has a big appetite in East Asia. And the question is, can we cobble together a balancing coalition to contain China?
But what we're also seeing at this time, Parag Khanna, is that the world is getting split into two tech ecosystems, especially with the advent of 5G technologies, China and Huawei, ZTE on the one side, the Western world on the other. That is at the center of the emerging 5G economy. Given that, America has taken the kind of positions that it has, and countries like India and several others in Europe are taking clear positions against China and in favor of the Western 5G technology, even if it's more expensive and time consuming to roll out. Will that not push back China's economic advance, or do you share Professor Miyashama's contention that even if you try and split the world up into these two tech ecosystems, it doesn't fundamentally alter the inevitable rate of growth of China's economy?
I would err on the side of pointing to the fact that China has multiple engines of growth in its economy, and technology exports, as significant as they have been, is not a huge determinant. China's trade dependency has fallen very, very sharply in the last several decades. There's been a significant misperception on the part of Western analysts of the Chinese economy who have felt that it's too investment driven and not sufficiently consumption driven. The last few years of data make absolutely clear that it is a more balanced economy. Secondly, I'm sure you follow the terminology of what's known as dual circulation. And that's a combination of the external neo-mercantilism in terms of their pushing exports on the world and buying in, cheap raw materials and so forth, while becoming more self-sufficient internally. So again, going back to that trade dependence, they are self-sufficient now in many categories of consumer manufactured goods, and even as their population ages, they have been building the industrial automation capability to still remain the export powerhouse that they are. So I, again, among others, don't really worry that their economy, even as it will return to the deceleration. In other words, remember, prior to the pandemic, economic growth was very slow. It's not particularly high now. What's remarkable is that it's growing at all, but it will again decelerate, but it will still grow. And given its enormous size, any growth is significant. So we shouldn't really be worried about some notion that there is a big speed bump for its economy. There's plenty of headroom there, both in investment and services, consumption, trade, investment, and so on. So I think that their economy is going to be okay. On the technology side, just very quickly, the picture is much more diffuse than merely two camps. Certainly in terms of the so-called Western camp, it cannot be reduced to merely the American. You have the European 5G technology, the Japanese 5G technology. When it comes to even artificial intelligence, you have India, Japan, and other players, Internet of Things, and so forth. There's many players in the marketplace. And China was ascendant in many ways, but even Huawei had never had more than a 35% market share. So we have to view this in a framework of action and reaction. And the reaction has been very strong in terms of building up the industrial capacity, the technological capability, even in areas like as simple as rare earth minerals, where there is a global supply base, a resource base, but only China took the sort of the initiative to monetize it. Others will do the same. So I think we will have a much more distributed landscape of technology providers and a very competitive landscape.
Professor Yoon Sun, how soon, in your estimate, does China think it will be able to overtake the United States? The pandemic did give the Chinese economy a bump, even as it brought the American economy and the rest of the world's economy down. And what, in your conception, is China's idea of world economic domination? How do they see becoming the top economy of the world alter Beijing's relationship with world capitals?
Well, thank you for the question. I think, so if the first question is when is China thinks itself will overtake the United States, it depends on which area that we're speaking of, and it depends on who you ask. So for example, if we talk about economic indicators, there are actually a lot of Chinese officials and experts who believe that China has already surpassed the United States to become the largest economy in the world. Well, it depends on which indicator or which calculation method that you use. But there is a very strong confidence, for example, among the wolf warrior diplomats in China, that given the size of the Chinese population, the size of the Chinese market, and also the accumulated technological advantages that China has been able to gather in the past 4 decades, that China is already the powerhouse and has already overtaken the United States. But if the question is that has China overtaken the United States militarily or as a hegemon in the world, which I really admire Professor Mearsheimer's writing on this topic, I think the answer in China is pretty realistic, which is, well, China is not there yet. China has not solved this national unification problem with Taiwan, and China's primary security concern remains to be in its periphery. So for China to develop that global military presence and global military ambition, I think the Chinese will recognize that they're still far off on that. In terms of the world economic domination, well, the Chinese would use the Belt and Road as an example to show the kind of world economic order or the kind of desired role that China plays in the world. And in many ways, I think the Chinese philosophy or Xi Jinping's political philosophy sees China as this benevolent hegemon that will somehow overtake the United States as a supplier, as a provider of global public good. Well, there are a lot of countries who disagree with the way that the Chinese are going about it, and also about the end game that China is trying to project. Because based on what we have seen, when China encounters disagreements from other countries, the benevolence is gone. And what is showing instead is coercion, either diplomatic or economic sanctions, or sometimes political coercions. And there's a very big question for a lot of countries, especially countries in China's neighborhood, as for when is China going to use military aggression to show their dissatisfaction. And I think in the case of India, we saw some of that last year. So as for just one last point very quickly about the question that we were debating, is China going to be contained? I particularly agree with Professor Kanwal that the answer is not going to be yes or no. The answer is going to be very gray. That, for example, BRI has been seen by many, even in China, as China's own imperial overstretch. That given how much money is being lost along the way, given the white elephant projects that are prevalent under BRI, a lot of people feel that, well, China is actually wasting its money in this meaningless overstretch geopolitically without geoeconomic guarantee that the influence will be achieved. So taking into consideration the domestic economic slowdown and the technological restriction that China still faces from the United States, Huawei is in tremendous trouble these days. So I would say that the Chinese economic is going to be affected by all these factors, despite the fact that the Chinese believe that China has prevailed after 2020 out of the quagmire of COVID. Thank you.
Navteej Sarna, India finds itself in the unenviable position of having to compete with China, which has prepared itself for this moment for 4 decades. While we've been growing, but not relative to the speed at which mainland China has been growing. How then should India approach the next few years, given the fact that Beijing thinks this is when it will be overtaking the US, and the US is struggling to compete and contain Beijing economically? What should India be doing, given that the dragon has already bared its fangs?
Well, I think China has been preparing for this moment, but I think India has been always aware of this moment in more ways than one, and that is why that has governed a lot of our foreign policy choices and a lot of our sort of careful treading on several issues. We know we have a dangerous neighbor, and that has really determined a lot of our decisions on security and other matters. Now, in economic terms, I mean, there never has been a question that China has grown much faster. And I think we'd be living in a fool's paradise to think that we can simply catch up with China at the moment. In fact, at the moment, the way the world looks is that no country possibly, not even the United States, can handle China economically and militarily on its own. So we need to work together. We need to engage with others. The pandemic is a certain moment. It has turned the mood against China in many ways. There was a rush for decoupling, and now there is a realistic reassessment that all decoupling is not possible, not even by India. But at the same time, it has shown the resilience of the Chinese economy. I mean, their fourth quarter rates are very impressive indeed compared to the rest of the world. So I think what people are looking at is strengthening their own economies. Biden's Buy America plan concentrates on bringing back manufacturing, bringing innovation, etc., back into the United States. We are trying to do much the same. I think in the years to come, we can be looking at. I mean, if there's one word to describe it, I think it's going to be competition. Containment is going to be an incomplete factor. We are going to compete in many ways, not just in trade, but in actually our worldviews of the economy. And this is where one point which has not been made, and I'll drop it and leave it for you, is whether in the Indo-Pacific, this move that India has been saying, inclusivity of the Indo-Pacific, whether in some economic areas you can actually include China rather than have a kind of mini Cold War going on in the Indo-Pacific. I'll just leave that thought. I don't have time to expand on it.
But Dhruv, Jaishankar, is this a competition India is well poised for? Because you've got Beijing, whose economic growth is at this moment unsettling the United States, and you've got India now not just having to compete with China economically, but also having to double up its spending on military purchases because of the ever-present and real threat that China poses along India's northern border. So how should India be playing its cards over the next 4 years, in your view?
Well, I'm not saying, I won't say how India should, but I would actually say that India has a lot of advantages that sometimes go underappreciated. One is that it has a wide range of partners with most of the major powers barring China. So, India has deepening defense technological relationships with the United States, with Russia, with France, with Southeast Asia. It has growing economic ties with Japan, with the Gulf, with Southeast Asia. So I think that is clearly one advantage that India has, and again, it remains to be seen how much and to what degree India can take advantage of all of those external relationships, and to improve India's own capability to compete. The other thing is, I think India is relatively well placed vis-a-vis China, at least compared to some of the other countries in China's periphery, in the sense that while its military is relatively large, relatively sophisticated in certain areas. It has shown an ability to push back against Chinese assertiveness in the recent past. It has, a maritime capability that most countries in the Indian Ocean region do not have. Most resident powers in the Indian Ocean region do not have. I do think that there are those advantages there. And finally, I think if you look at sort of longer-term economic competition, while in the near term there are countries like Vietnam that are much better prepared to be a recipient of investment and take advantage of disrupted supply chains in the region. Over the long term, India has the capability of offering scale that a lot of other countries do not have. So I think many of the ingredients are there for India to manage well in this era of emerging great power competition, given Indian interest. I think it remains to be seen to the degree to which India can take advantage of all of that.
In the last part of this discussion, I want to focus now on balancing coalitions, which Professor John Mearsheimer spoke of as being key to containing or warding off the Chinese threat. At this moment, there is no military coalition for the Indo-Pacific region in the way that you had NATO for the safety and security of Europe during the Cold War with the USSR. Is it likely that an arrangement which has been loose so far, like the Quad, over the next few years develops into a military coalition? Or do you think, given the wariness of India, maybe to some extent even Japan, that is unlikely? And if these capitals aren't willing to come together as a formal military coalition, what shape do you see the balancing coalition against China take, Professor John Mearsheimer?
Well, the real problem here is geography. The countries that the United States would have to put together to create a balancing coalition are spread out all over Asia, broadly defined. Just think about the geographical distance between Japan on one hand and India on the other. So you're talking about cobbling together an alliance that's geographically dispersed, and that's very tricky to do. During the Cold War, where the central point of focus was in the heart of Europe, you had, British, German, Dutch, Belgium, and French and American forces all very closely located on the Central Front. And it was easy to put together a meaningful balancing coalition in Europe and even in East Asia with Japan and South Korea. But the task here is much more difficult, and much depends on the United States. American leadership is essential because the United States has such a huge economy and so much military capability. And again, the problem with President Trump was that he did a terrible job dealing with allies and putting together a balancing coalition. The fact is that if you look at individual countries like India, for example, they alone are going to be in real trouble if they try to contain the Chinese all by themselves. China has a much bigger economy than India does right now. It spends a lot more money on defense. And it's likely that the gap in the size of those two economies and the gap between their military capabilities is only going to grow over time. And India has all sorts of strategic problems. It not only has to worry about the line of actual control, it has to build military forces to deal with Pakistan, and then it has to build a powerful navy or maintain a powerful navy because of what's going to happen in the Indian Ocean. You want to remember that the Chinese are building a blue water navy. They plan to project power into the Indian Ocean, and the Indians are going to have to respond to that at the same time they're responding to the Pakistanis and they're responding to the Chinese on the line of actual control. And this is all in the context of a situation where China is growing more and more powerful. So India is going to need help. The Americans are going to need help. The Japanese are going to need help. And the $64,000 question, as we used to say in the United States when I was young, is whether or not all of these countries could come together and create an alliance structure that looks somewhat like NATO, that enables us collectively to contain China.
But there is a difference between NATO and what Quad could become if it becomes a military alliance, in the sense that, Navteet Sarna, it's largely only India that faces China on the land border. So the other countries have a maritime dispute with China, or they have maritime security concerns. India actually is facing with military land-based aggression by China. Do you see this balancing coalition take a more formal military alliance-like structure over the next few years? Is that inevitable or unlikely in your view?
Well, one can't really predict, but I would not put my money on it. We are traditionally not comfortable at all with the idea of military alliances. The other reason is that the problems that are faced in the Indo-Pacific are of different kinds. They are fundamental in terms of maritime security, freedom of navigation, but there are threats to sovereignty. There are threats to economic sovereignty through the BRI. So there are threats to democracy. So I think, given that the different kinds of problems, the answer probably lies in what has been called somewhere bespoke coalitions. So these are sort of loose coalitions coming together for a particular set of objectives and purposes. And I think that is the actually an inherent strength, say, not an institution, but a sort of gathering like the Quad. The second thing we have to remember is that the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN, already has a multiplicity of regional structures. The fact is that they are a little tied down, they are a little nervous. So the possibilities of piggybacking on those structures by other economies, by other militaries and navies from the other parts of the world, like the US and India and others, in a more engaged fashion could be the answer. So I don't see the Quad itself as the answer to everything. There are a number of other or possible regional structures that can play a role. And I think the future probably lies in countries coming together more loosely for a given set of objectives rather than getting stuck in a formal so-called alliance. There is today a lot you can do without being an alliance member.
Professor Yun Sun, I want to put you in a bit of a spot. Do you see over the next few years, and what time frame would you associate with what Beijing calls its grand reunification dream of ensuring that Taiwan at some point in time becomes a part of mainland China? There are two ways that I see it. One, building military capability enough that the United States, because of how far Taiwan is from the US, simply feels it's impossible to try and come to Taiwan's rescue because of the kind of military capabilities that China has been able to build. The other is that if the Chinese Navy was to go in, the United States responds as it has promised Taiwan that it will. So do you see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan happening? What time frame would you associate with this, and how important is it for the mandarins of Beijing to have Taiwan a part of modern day China, and to what extent will they go to make this happen?
Well, thank you. That is a great question. Well, China's preparation for Taiwan, there are two plans. There's a preferred plan, and then there's also the backup plan. The preferred plan is peaceful unification, is to use China's economic growth and China's increased comprehensive national power to show the world and to show Taiwan that unification is inevitable. And the calculation in this scenario about the United States is that there will be a day that the power difference between China and the United States is going to become so small that the US will realize that the cost that it will have to pay to defend a remote island so far away from its homeland is not going to be so significant that it overweighs, that it is beneficial for the United States to defend Taiwan. So that peaceful unification plan, I think as of today, is still Xi Jinping's preferred action agenda. But we always look at China's military intention and what is China's military preparedness to take Taiwan through the use of force. And I call that China's backup plan. Because what that plan is indeed designed for is for the scenario that Taiwan declares independence, and the mainland has to have a reaction to it. And so in that sense, I don't think China will actively seek unification through the use of military force, but instead it is primarily prepared as a response to the declaration of Taiwan independence or any major events that will make Taiwan independent. But having said that, it does not necessarily mean that the Chinese military coercion of Taiwan is going to be any less significant in the years that we're looking ahead. So a lot of it depends on how China interacts with Biden administration. For example, the Chinese are asking the key question that is Biden going to continue President Trump's policy towards Taiwan, which has included a lot of tacit and implicit alignment building and also official ties or semi-official ties with the Taiwan Authority. So is Biden going to continue those policies which will push the Chinese military preparedness to a more urgent position? Or Biden is going to return to what the Chinese would call the previous policy, which strictly follows the status quo, which also will make China a little bit more comfortable and more content to pursue its peaceful unification scenario. Thank you.
So you're saying that peaceful reunification is the ideal scenario, but Parag Khanna, we're seeing how the Chinese military is getting more and more aggressive, whether it's the Air Force or the Navy in the Taiwan Straits. And any pushback from Chinese fighter jets when they're in the sky, any scramble to ward the Chinese planes off can, very unintentionally spark off a much bigger crisis. Do you see Beijing make a military dash for Taiwan? How possible do you think this scenario is? And how do you see Beijing trying to achieve this idea of reunification, which Xi Jinping clearly seems to hold very dear to his heart?
It certainly does. There should be no doubt about Beijing's intent the timeline and the strategy which Beijing will pursue to achieve reunification is something that's subject to a lot of debate and speculation. There have been times when there have been peaceful diplomatic overtures to try to woo the government, such as when Xi Jinping and former President Ma met face to face for a meal in Singapore. And then there have been times of extreme hostility and military preparations and at least rehearsals for various attacks. So China is trying to telegraph all of these different approaches in order to maintain that flexibility. There was even a scenario that, given the Trump administration's policy and pressuring of TSMC Semiconductor to no longer sell its products, its output to Chinese clients or customers, that might spark an invasion. So, we can't really know when China would necessarily make a move, only that it would obviously prefer not to have to. But that's only one of the conflict formations, and we should not in any of them underestimate China's intent and its efforts to invest in the capacity to dominate certain battle spaces. We've just heard, for example, today that China has authorized Coast Guard vessels to fire upon ships from other nationalities that are seen to be trespassing certain maritime claims, for example. So there's no question that aggression is there, and therefore the wake-up call, again, one that predates the pandemic by several years, quite a few years, in fact. And let me just point out that going back to the early 2000s, when I was at the Brookings Institution, when Stephen Cohen was still around, he would, convene coalitions or diplomats, track 2 gatherings of Japanese, Australian, and Indians. And this was 20 years ago. We called that the global NATO, right? So this has been something that's been a concern for several decades. And yet, to this day, as others have also pointed out, we would hesitate to call it an alliance, because the term alliance is certainly far less common in Asian history and strategic and diplomatic relationships than it is in Western ones. So we need to be very cautious in using that term. So we will not have anything more
finally,
than coalitions.
Dhruv Jaishankar, where do you see the India-China military conflict go from here? We're in an uneasy state of truce, deployment in extremely cold conditions, inhuman conditions. Do you see this escalate, or do you just see this become an iced out border with high military deployment like we have with the Pakistani border along the line of control?
Well, I am not in a position to speculate about that. I mean, negotiations are underway by the two militaries and at the political level as well. And so it's hard to foresee what will happen in the near future. But for the time being, as long as there is this state of Chinese, a forward Chinese presence along the line of actual control, it's only natural that India will continue to intensify its balancing actions with other countries, and this will play out in a range of domains. Again, we saw, as Parag rightly pointed out, even before the coronavirus pandemic, even before the border crisis, we saw India tightening its investment restrictions against China. We've seen the app ban in the last over the last year. We've seen tightening of public procurement by the Indian government, again, with an eye on Chinese companies. And of course, a sort of intensification in multiple areas. I think if we look back on 2020, it's in some ways, I think Stein and other panelists have alluded to this, China opened up multiple fronts at the same time, and not just geographic fronts, but on technology, on human rights, on its economy and the Belt and Road Initiative, and on security matters. So you have, in some ways, as Ambassador Sana rightly pointed out, you have different configurations coming together, and yet there's also this converging, sort of topical converging taking place. So, the Make in China 2025 initiative has led to initiatives like the D10, which is a cooperation on 5G technology amongst like-minded democratic countries. You've seen a coalition building on artificial intelligence. You've seen on supply chain resilience, on infrastructure financing. So again, while it may not resemble an alliance in the sense that we may not have mutual defense treaties coming up between some of these countries, we'll have something that is in some ways much closer than To give just one example, India's relationship with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In some ways, already we have India, India and the US, just to give that example, are already cooperating in maritime domain awareness and on military exercises in a manner that would have been unforeseen during the Cold War. So again, we may not enter the stage of alliances as Professor Mearsheimer has suggested, but something quite close to that.
So we've had a very high quality conversation on the evolving security paradigm in the Indo-Pacific region, and this will play a major role in shaping global politics. And I want to thank dearly Professor John Mearsheimer, Dr. Parag Khanna, Professor Yun Sun, Navtej Sarna and Dhruva Jaishankar for taking our time for joining us at the India Today World Economic Forum Davos agenda. Thank you so much for joining us for this Global Roundtable. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.